Oh, hi everyone, and good evening to the annual HR talk at York University in the Monica Belcourt Speaker Series. My name is Parvudiyal Singh, and I'm the director of the School of Human Resource Management here at York University. First, I want to welcome all of you in this virtual format. Normally, we do this talk at York University, but this year has been, well, this year. I want to do a special welcome to our guest speaker, Timothy Judge, who will be introduced shortly. But my role tonight is fairly straightforward. I want to give you a quick background of the School of Human Resources Management and a little about Monica Belcourt. The School of Human Resource Management was launched in 2009. So we're about 10 years, a little bit over 10 years into it. Fairly young school. At the time we started, our aim was to be the leader in HRM education in Canada and globally. Um, we have we have currently four programs, 3 degree programs, one certificate. We have a Bachelor of Human Resource Management, a Master's of Human Resource Management, and a PhD in Human Resources Management, and as I said, a certificate in Human Resources Management. We currently have about approaching 900 to 1,000 students in HR in degree programs, which I think would make us the largest institution in higher education in HR globally. My numbers may be off a little bit, but that's what we think. But size, it's not only size. I think our quality has grown tremendously over time. All four of our programs, we have extraordinary alumni graduating, holding excellent jobs in their fields. We have excellent faculty, excellent staff, excellent support systems at York. And it's difficult to judge quality without being in formal rankings like in the traditional business schools. But there's one area where we do participate in a competition through the HR Reporter. As most of you would know, the HR Reporter is Canada's one of Canada's leading HR medium. So we participate in an annual competition in the HR Reporter in Reader's Choice Awards. And I'm very, very pleased to inform you that for the past 3 years, the School of Human Resource Management at York University has won the award as the top school in Canada, not only in the bachelor's program, not only in the master's program, not only in the PhD, but all four of our programs. That's incredibly good, and my thanks go out to all those who have made that possible. What I find really gratifying is that we compete with a group of really good universities, including the University of Toronto, University of British Columbia, and Queens. And as I keep saying, that's not a bad bunch to be with, especially when you're at the top. So we have done extremely well, and this series would not have been conceptualized, launched without the idea from Monica. Before I go on to Monica, a special thank you to Dr. Podolsky for organizing this event. He has gone out of his way to make this what it is this evening. Monica Belcourt, who this series is named after, is a trailblazer in HRM in Canada. She was instrumental in starting the bachelor's program here at York, the master's program here at York, and was part of the team that started the School of HRM. She was actually the founding director. She is authored. She's a good scholar. She was a practitioner before she before she got onto academia. She's authored several of Canada's leading textbooks in HR. And she was actually the past president of the HRPA. I've had the honor of working with Monica. She is a giant, and we thank her for this idea. We thank her every year for bringing someone to tell us about the field in a little bit more. Monica Belcourt, it's my pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you very much, Parvudiyal, and welcome to everyone. As like many of you, my career life has consisted of working with academics and working both with and as an HR practitioner. And one of the things I've always been curious about is when I'm working with academics, they tend to do research that interests them, that build on other professors' research, but they seldom go out to talk to the HR professionals and ask them, what are the issues important to you? What kinds of problems would you like some evidence-based research to solve? And the same thing when I was dealing and working with HR practitioners, particularly when I was volunteering at HRPAO, was that we would be talking and they would identify a problem, and in order to solve that problem or practice or know what's best to do, they would go to their colleagues or they would go to some popular journalists, but they almost never went to an academic, and they certainly never read research journals. And so I saw this huge disconnect. And so when I was president of HRPAO, I did a few things. I organized a few series like this one at conferences where I'd have academics come in to talk about their research and listen to what HR professionals had to say about that. And then I also organized kind of think tanks and councils where HR practitioners could explain to academics, these are the kinds of problems we're trying to solve. Can you give us guidance? What do you know that's available from research that may help us solve this problem? HR Talks is simply a continuation of that. It's an effort to get particularly our alumni, keep them current with top of the line research, and connect the academics and the people who are actually working in the field. And so I think this is about number 5 and of what we're doing and in HR Talks. So we're very excited to have a talk about leadership practices. I would also, like Prabhudio, like to acknowledge the amount of effort that Mark Podolsky, who's a co-author with me on strategic human resource planning, it has put into making this event happen, what is a difficult year. So thank you very much, Mark, and everybody else, thank you very much for participating, and I'm looking forward to the talk.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Prabhudio. I'm very excited to introduce our guest speaker to this year's Monica Belcourt Series. With over 160 publications in refereed journals and 130,000 citations, Dr. Tim Judge has been described as the Roger Federer of the organizational sciences. For the academics joining us this evening, a search of your computer will probably bring up a dozen or more articles authored by Tim Judge. I can think of several articles of his that have guided my own research and influenced my everyday life as well. I even try to raise my children in line with the concept of core self-evaluations by doing my best to instill self-esteem and self-efficacy in them. And his research has contributed a great deal to what we know about organizational fit and the relationship between personality and work. And so Dr. Judge's work is very much in line with our central mission at the School of Human Resource Management to make our work relevant to bridging the gap between research and practice in our field. And so it's my honor and a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Tim Judge.
Well, thank you, Mark. I appreciate the introduction. I'm really honored to be here with you tonight. I only wish I could be in Toronto. It's one of my favorite cities. I've been there, I think, a half dozen times and would love to be there. But I really look forward to talking with you today. This is something that I'm very passionate about that really has been a journey of its own for me. And so I hope that you'll find my talk interesting, and I look forward to your question and answers. Please do use the Q&A feature in Zoom. I'll remind you of that shortly, but definitely we'll have time for questions at the end, and would love to hear from you. So the title of my talk is Problems or Mysteries, the State of Leadership, Research, and Practice. I'm a mountain climber, so this is a mountain that I've climbed, the Grand Teton, so I have to work this climbing into everything that I talk about. And what my question is, are we reaching the summit or falling off the cliff? And where did I get the idea of problems or mysteries? Well, I'll give extra credit to anyone who, without looking it up, knows who wrote this quote. Our ignorance can be divided into problems or mysteries. When we face a problem, we may not know its solution, but we have insight, increasing knowledge, and an inkling of what we are looking for. The reason I think that is apt in this case is I'd like to tell you that the problem I'm going to talk to you about, which really Monica aptly described a solution for, this research practice gap, I'd like to tell you I think it's getting better, but I'm not sure that it is. And what I'd like to talk to you about tonight is to try to demonstrate, I think, the depth of the problem and then point a way toward solutions toward that. So with that in mind, this is the structure of my talk. I tend to go through my slides fairly quickly, and please do pose questions on the Zoom Q&A feature. Mark, I believe, will be posing those questions for everyone at the end, because I'll have plenty of time to answer those. So part one, the state of leadership research. Well, it may surprise you to know that, that there are more than 81,000 entries in the Web of Science with the word leader or leadership in the title. So it is an extraordinarily popular area of study. And indeed, since 2016, there have been more than 26,000 entries. Now, those are mostly peer-reviewed journal articles. There also include commentaries, dissertations, but a lot of scholarly activity around the area of leadership. And in fact, at the current rate, there are more than 14 articles published every single day on the topic of leadership, which is, I think, extraordinary. Another thing that before I really started looking at the field and directing the Leadership Center that I do at Ohio State, is that leadership really is multidisciplinary. When I took this position, Ohio State has 15 colleges, and we interviewed and talked with every single dean of every college, and they're all passionate about leadership and developing leadership skills in their students. And moreover, on the research side, as you see from this chart to the left, it truly is a multidisciplinary endeavor. In fact, I think it surprises some people to know there are more articles on leadership in healthcare and medicine than there are in any of the other individual categories. So it's studied from many different perspectives, and there's a lot to be learned from those. That's, I think, in some ways a sign, both in the quantity of the articles published, but also the diversity of the perspectives, a sign of the strength and interest in the topic. Now, if you look at this chart, you see that if you focus first on the gray bars, the number of articles on the topic of leadership are growing exponentially. And so it's just really skyrocketing. Now, that's true. There are more journals and more articles published, and I won't present it here just because I don't want to inundate you with slides. But if you compare leadership to other topics, the growth of articles on leadership in academic research is increasing faster than other disciplines within the management domain, broadly construed. You see citations are also increasing. The only, I think, real reason for the drop off is that citations are lagged. So if you look at very recent articles and how often they're cited, obviously those accrue over time. So that is also increasing dramatically over time. So to kind of really summarize leadership research briefly, is that it is a multidisciplinary topic that's growing really rapidly. If you break kind of the core topics of organizational sciences down, and I just give some examples there, leadership was not always the most popular topic, but it is now. And so you see more articles on leadership than any other individual broad topic in the organizational sciences. And as I indicated earlier, more than 14 articles published every single day. So it's a vast and quickly accumulating literature. It's also true that universities, as you may know, have a vested interest in leadership. There are more than 200 leadership centers and institutes in North American universities. Many universities have several leadership centers or institutes. They vary. We've studied those and analyzed those as part of what we do, and we actually have data on those. If you're ever interested, we'd be happy to share comparative data in terms of where they're housed, what their main area of focus is, and what their size or other data that we have on them. Many of them are in business schools, but many of them are also in student life organizations, liberal arts colleges, distributed kind of throughout the university. We have one here at Ohio State in actually the College of Agriculture. So you'd look at all of the data I just presented to you in a kind of whirlwind fashion, and you think, well, everything is really well, right? This is a sign of a healthy discipline. Well, here I'll start to present, I think, some areas of the problem. Here's I like quotes. Snow and adolescence are the only problems that disappear if you ignore them long enough. Sometimes I think we ignore some of the problems that we see in our field and assume they'll go away. So what I'm going to talk about now is the other side of the coin, which is the practice problem. I'll return to the area of leadership research where I think it's led to some of the issues that I'm going to surface. Well, again, this is just kind of another way of looking at this exponential growth in leadership publications, which suggests a discipline that really is expanding rapidly. And you'd think, well, that must mean that the leadership research has a tremendous impact. Well, in fact, that's not really true. So if you compare leadership research compared to Amazon entries, and I'll get it more into this while I'm looking at this in a minute. And by the way, did you know Amazon Orange has its own RGB code for its color, which I have in here, so it would make the benevolent Jeff Bezos happy. You see that actually the peer-reviewed research is being dwarfed by popular books on leadership. And you see in this area of pink that our most selective journals, they are positively being dwarfed by these. And in fact, you can't really even see the pink bar on this chart unless you do 16 times magnification, and then you can barely see it. Now, you may say, well, why is this a problem? It's not really a problem that Amazon books on leadership are exploding relative to the peer-reviewed literature. Well, I think it is a sign of a problem. So here are New York Times bestsellers on leadership. You may be a fan of some of these books. I've read a number of them myself, and you may say, well, I really like these books. What are the problem with them? Well, I'm about to show you one problem, which is that these books contain a lot of pithy advice. So these are all recommendations that are provided in these best-selling books. And as you see, they tend to emphasize sort of these, I think, fairly simple recommendations for how to lead effectively. And I'm not done yet. Fortunately for you, I'm speeding up the animation. But you see a lot of really kind of trite pieces of advice. I'm still not finished. And I think what happens when we encounter these books is that we often kind of cherry pick and pull out the pieces of advice that we think are most helpful to us. You know, I'm certainly not against self-help. I'm not against these books. But I think it would be fair to say these are not scientific treatments, and we have to ask ourselves, what's the problem created by that? And I think one area in which we delude ourselves is when we compare the impact of what I call these gurus, the people who really have had a lot of influence on leadership practice and decision makers and leaders themselves, to the scientific literature. It's a pretty stark comparison. So I'm about to show you that. Now, if you look at Google Scholar, which for those of you not familiar with it, it's a database that basically tries to assess within an academic community how often works are cited. And what I've looked at are the 10 authors of the books that I just showed you, these New York Times bestsellers, which are some of the best-selling books in the area of leadership ever, with the 10 most cited leadership researchers. And if you look within Google Scholar, you see actually the top 10 leadership researchers, their work is cited more than the gurus. But that itself is pretty limited, because I don't think anybody outside of academics really looks at Google Scholar very much. So if instead you look at Google Hits, so if you search these authors in the Google search box, and you compare Google Scholar hits to Google Hits, this is the difference that you get. And so if you accumulate the Google hits for the gurus to the scholars, what you see is over 32 million hits for the gurus, and a much smaller number, 37,000, for the leadership scholars. And you see, if you compare these, there's only one metric that really dominates here, which is the Google hits. And so that's where the popularity of the perspective lies. Now, there are other ways to demonstrate this. So if you look at Twitter, now most of us leadership scholars, we don't even have Twitter accounts, or if we do, we're not particularly active on it. And I have some comparison of the gurus to actual universities. And I provided the largest universities in Canada, which you all know well. Of course, being active on Twitter, as we know from our president, is not always a positive thing. So perhaps I'm sure some of Ohio State's Twitter tweets are for some of the negative things and scandals. But really look at the gurus. I mean, individually, they are dominating even entire universities. And John Maxwell, he has so many Twitter followers, you can't even plot it on this. It goes off, literally off the chart. So my point in this is that the leadership gurus, the people writing these popular best-selling books on leadership, are having an absolutely enormous effect on how people are thinking. Leaders and people aspiring to be leaders on leadership. University life is having a relatively small impact, and these gurus are even dominating, at least in some metrics, the universities themselves. Now, it's also true, if you just would subject it to the market comparison, this is it's not a wholly scientific study that I did, but it was based on objective data. You see that the gurus, if you want them to come and consult in your organization, you'd better get out your credit card, because it's going to be expensive. And that, again, is of course not the only way to look at this, but that is the market test of how much in demand the gurus' perspectives are versus the academic researchers. So in a way, this situation, I think, gets even worse. So if you look at other New York Times best-selling books on leadership, here are some examples. One thing I would say is, it's pretty bad when a best-selling book on leadership is by somebody who doesn't even exist, which I hate to disappoint any of you, which I would say is Santa Claus. And again, this is, I'll discuss, this is a problem that is not just one-sided. H.L. Mencken once said, I told you how much I like quotes. He said, there's a simple, easy answer to every problem, and it's wrong. There are multiple reasons for this problem I'm documenting. So before I get to the reasons that I believe the problem exists, it is true, leadership research continues to grow. It's also true that leadership research, if you judge it by citations, has had a large impact in the scientific or research community. but that impact is positively dwarfed by writers and practicing leaders who write about leadership. Now, this is the part where I'm going to turn my attention to problems in the research literature on leadership. And so, it's relevant to ask, well, is this a function of attention spans of people, or are there endemic problems in leadership research itself that's causing its impact to be mitigated? And you can see where my answer is going to be, which is that part of the problem is indeed in the literature itself. So where is this scientific problem that I'm talking about? Well, the literature has produced insights, so I don't want to engage in these so-called straw person arguments where it's all or nothing. It's not as if you would take the entire corpus of leadership research and just throw it away. There are, I think, many useful insights to be gained from it. But I think there are also problems that, in fact, are getting worse. And what I'm going to do is try to demonstrate the magnitude of that problem to you. So if you wanted one very simplistic slide that told you about the history of leadership research, it's been really dominated by theories and perspectives more than most any discipline I can think of. And the earliest school of thought was really the trait school of thought. And, Thomas Carlyle, a Victorian writer, penned this in today what we would call a very sexist quote, which is that history is nothing but the biographies of a few great men. So if you made that more inclusive and said a few great people, that is really particularly the early history of trait research, the assumption that really people are endowed with talent factors, we could call them traits, that help them be effective leaders. And it's kind of this perspective, leaders are born, they're not made. Well, obviously one limitation, I've studied leader traits a lot, one limitation with that perspective is, first of all, of course, we know that that's not the whole story. It would be pretty depressing if most of the outcomes that happen in life were predestined. Fortunately, that's not the case. And the question then researchers turn to, starting in really World War II, a lot of that research was actually done at Ohio State, the so-called behavioral school, which argued that, well, traits may exist, but it's more meaningful to focus on behaviors because ultimately, of course, it's what leaders do that really matters. And so various schools of thought, including this so-called behavioral school at Ohio State, focused on discrete leader behaviors. And the two behaviors that are most associated with the Ohio State studies, as you may know, are consideration and initiating structure. That school was really dominant for a very long period of time, and really born from that, though, was this contingency school, which basically said, well, yes, behaviors may matter, but it totally depends on the situation or the context or other factors. So there was a lot of research looking at variables that would impact the effective leader behaviors on outcomes. For example, Fred Fiedler, who was known for LPC theory, I won't go into it's kind of an arcane theory, I won't go into the details of it, but he essentially said that the leadership style that works best depends on the situation. And that situation can be defined by three properties: the leader position power, leader member relations, so how well do the leader and followers get along, and what was the third? I'll think of it. And so in Fiedler's view, that if the situation was really favorable, and positive leader position power, sorry, that was the third one. The situation is really favorable to the leader, then either a very autocratic or a very benevolent approach worked best. If the position was more favorable, then this middle style worked best. Well, as you might imagine, contingency theories quickly get very complex, and you can imagine in a practical sense a leader thinking, gee, is this situation positive or negative, and what are the properties of it, and how I tailor my leadership style to the situation. It has really some pretty basic implementation problems, even though, of course, in some ways the premise of it is true, which is that behaviors that may work in one situation may not necessarily work in another. Really, this theory I highlight in the middle, transformational leadership, that really has been the most influential and successful theory. I would include charismatic leadership as part of that. In the history of leadership research, there's been more studies done on that theory than any other. And I think there's, it's been influential for a good reason. I think really the heart of transformational leadership theory is its focus on vision. It's really critical that our leaders articulate a clear, compelling vision, and it's not just leaders at the upper echelons, but all leaders should be able to define a vision for the unit or the individuals are overseeing. And then also what I call a charismatic communication style. So how we articulate that vision matters as well. Now, from the baseline of transformational leadership, there have been other perspectives, and I would say right now we're in a sort of a mode of what I would call benevolent leadership. So different ways of looking at really on the negative side, narcissistic or autocratic leadership. On the more positive side, leader humility and benevolence. And one of the problems with all of these theories, while I think they've made a lot of contributions, is they tend to be between individual in their focus. And so, you may be more transformational and more visionary than I am, but that doesn't really help me get better. It just facilitates a comparison between the two of us. That may be important if I'm making a leader selection decision. It's not really helpful to me if I just need to be a more visionary leader tomorrow than I am today. And most of these tend to be these between individual sort of style approaches, which is something I'll talk about in a moment. Now, the focus on theories, as I indicated, I think leadership research has been quite theoretical. And you see there continue to be more theoretical concepts introduced. And here I'm just focusing on top tier journals, so the most selective journals in our field. And you can see there continue to be many leadership concepts. And again, I would argue most of these are style oriented, more generalized approaches to leadership. They continue to come to the fore. It starts to become very confusing, of course, because you can imagine if there were this many equally effective treatments for any medical condition, it would be pretty hard for a physician to know how to treat a patient. It's pretty hard for a leader to look at the literature and look at all these concepts and say, you mean I'm supposed to be all of these things? And if not, which of these is most important? As a field, we don't have an answer to that question. It tends to be on what we study or what we think is important, and that's problematic. Okay, now it gets worse than that. So the literature also focuses a lot on moderators and mediators. So if you analyze just peer-reviewed journals in the last 10 years, and moderators are variables, they're these contingency variables, as I talked about, that the effect of a leadership style or approach or behavior depends on this variable. The last 10 years, how many of these discrete moderators do you think have been identified in the literature? Well, it's 256. In fact, I'm going to show you all of those. And how many mediators? So mediators are explanatory variables. So they're what stand between the leadership behavior and some outcome that we're looking at. How many of those do you think have been identified in the literature? Well, that's 438. I'm also going to show you all of those. Now, fortunately for you, I'm going to do that very quickly. So these are the moderators, and I grouped them according to follower characteristics. So these are characteristics, emotional states, cognitions, attitudes, behaviors on the follower that affect, or that the leader behavior, the effect of the leader on the outcome is contingent on these characteristics. And then there are a bunch of leader characteristics. And then there are a bunch of other characteristics. And if you look at this, and again, if somebody's trying to make sense of this literature, it's like, oh, okay, if I want to be an effective leader, I need to work my way through about 25 different behaviors that seem to get studied a lot. And then all of those behaviors could depend on 256 contingencies. Oh, that's really simple. I really know how to be a good leader in this case. So it shows the inordinate complexity of the literature and not enough synthesizing of what is happening. So the 438 moderators, and again, there are a lot of them. The follower characteristics I couldn't even fit on one slide. And if you look at, in fact, it takes 3 slides. Leader characteristics that act as moderators. Again, many of those directly gleaned from the literature. Organization characteristics, team characteristics, or ones on the right-hand column that you classify organization, task, or team characteristics. Again, just an enormous amount of complexity. This literature is so dense and so complex that researchers themselves can't hope to make sense of it, the so-called experts in it. So that's one definite problem in the literature, is there's an enormous amount of complexity, but it gets worse. So if you look at the actual studies themselves, so not just look at all the studies and look at the vast complexity of the cumulative knowledge that has been acquired, if you just analyze the individual studies themselves, you see that there tends to be consistency in how they orient themselves. So one way to look at this, and my general premise, is that as in most areas of the organizational sciences, researchers are really interested in theory and methodology. That's what tends to explain whether a paper is accepted or rejected. That tends to be the focus of how we build our theories, as we had discussed before. And in fact, if you just analyze the articles themselves, you can prove the point. So if you just do a word count, scrape the articles and do a word count on the sections of the article and how they've allocated the space. Okay, and what you can see is about 10% of the words are in the introduction to the article, about 23% on the theory, about 30% on the method and results in that section, 17% the discussion, and 2% on practical implications. And then the remainder are the references that are listed. Okay. So is it any wonder why there's reason to question the practical impact of leadership research when so little attention is devoted to explaining why the study even matters? And one thing I neglected to mention before is, if you look at my research, it's every bit as subject in the past to these criticisms as the rest of the studies that I'm characterizing. I've not been really any different than what I'm criticizing. Okay, so there are other ways of showing this real gap between what should be important and what really is important. I did a survey of leadership scholars, and I asked them to assign, and this was maybe about 70 scholars, I asked them to assign points to what does matter in terms of journal acceptance decisions and what should matter. And you see the biggest gulf here is these ivory colored areas, which is between the relevance, practical importance of the findings. And when scholars had to devote 100 points to what matters, they gave 8 points, just very little, to the practical relevance of the paper in terms of how much it contributed to whether a paper was published or not. But what should matter, you see, they actually gave practical relevance almost an equal weight to the other areas. So there's just this enormous gap between what journals are favoring and what I think many people think should be the case. Now, it's not unique to leadership, either fortunately or unfortunately, and there's a recent article last year in the Chronicle of Higher Education about how political science in its pursuit of rigor has contributed in this, this is a well-known political science scholar, to its irrelevance. So to read this quote, the problem in a nutshell is that scholars increasingly privilege rigor over relevance. That has become strikingly apparent in the subfield of international security, which I think is Desch's particular focus, the part of political science that once most successfully balanced those tensions and has now fully permeated political science as a whole. This skewed set of intellectual priorities and the field's transition into a cult of the irrelevant is the unintended result of disciplinary professionalization. And again, I think you could substitute leadership or most other areas of the organizational sciences in there. You know, the articles, I'm teaching a doctoral seminar right now, and I remember we had a class the day before yesterday, and one of the doctoral students asked me if I could explain. He had a really hard problem with one of the articles understanding. He asked me if I could explain to him certain aspects of the article. Well, I couldn't. And I looked up several other articles that made use of that particular theoretical approach. Very dense, very hard to understand. I've been in this field for 30 years. I don't know how you translate that into something somebody outside the field could ever hope to understand. Now, does that mean that papers like that shouldn't be published? No, not necessarily, but when those sorts of papers are what are predominating in the field, and I think the research has become more and more rigorous and therefore dense and impenetrable, then you should not wonder why that has limited impact on the people outside the field. It's fully predictable, isn't it? So here's the two sides of the problem. On the one hand, we have the guru leadership books, which are often really well written. They're often by very credible leaders, but they tend to be what I would call war stories. It's like, this is my approach. This is what I've learned. This is how I lead. And again, I'm not saying there cannot be anything useful learned from that, but it would be as if we accumulated medical knowledge based on a successful physician who's practiced for 30 years, and she tells you, oh, this is how I've learned to treat, pancreatic cancer. It's not that her knowledge would be wrong. It's not that some other practitioner treats pancreatic cancer, that his experience is necessarily wrong either. It's that these kind of N of one perspectives are not scientific. And again, just because they're not scientific doesn't mean it's wrong, but there are limitations to that. Sometimes they argue that they're evidence-based and research-based. I think if you really look at what they're citing and how they cite it, I think that's essentially not the case. And again, as that busy slide I presented to you shows, often the advice is pretty pithy, pretty simplistic. It's often accompanied by, I think, really interesting, rich, good examples. You know, I gave a TED style talk once. I hope you cannot find it anywhere. You'd be sorry if you saw it, but I actually had a coach tell me this is how you have to give a TED style talk. You have a truth point, which is basically what's the main theme that you want to communicate. And around that, you story tell. And at the most you can have beyond that one proof point is what she called, and I think she was excellent, what she did. I was just sorry she had such a poor subject in me to work with, that you can have two children. So she would call that main point the parent, and that parent could have two children. But it has to be a very simple story. And in essence, what you're doing is telling a story around that main point. Well, this is what most of the popular books on leadership are doing, aren't they? They're very easy to penetrate, I think, to understand. They tend to be well written. They're rich with stories and perspectives, are often written by leaders who we respect. And that's absolutely swamping what's on the left-hand side here, which is this academic literature that I think is inordinately complex, that is really impossible. I don't even think people in our field can fully comprehend, partly because the information is accumulating so quickly and it's so complex that it defies really any true ability to synthesize well. So because of that, it really fails, I think, on its own criteria. And my point is, even if the popular press on leadership didn't exist, I would submit that the academic literature on leadership still would have limited impact, because it is so dense and so complex. It's really impossible. It's hard for anybody to assimilate and integrate, but it's also hard. You know, most universities have media relations people who attempt to translate our research into press releases and other findings with the hope that it'll have practical impact. They have a heck of a job trying to make sense of, I think, the really dense nature of what we're studying. So the kind of last part of my talk is, well, where can we go from here? Where's the path forward? Now, I'd love to be able to tell you that I was so smart that I figured all of this out, and all I'm going to do is tell you how I've solved the problem. Well, as you might have gathered on your own already, I'm not that smart. So the best I can do is tell you that we're working on it. You know, at Ohio State, we have a leadership initiative that I lead, and its main focus really is twofold. One is to use evidence-based techniques to improve the leadership skills of our students. And we have a lot of students on Ohio State. I know York is a very large university itself. Ohio State is even bigger. I think Ohio State has 70,000 students. The business school alone has, I think, 8,500 students. So one of the things we try to do is scale meaningful leadership development for our students using evidence-based techniques. And that means we try to use the scientific literature where we can to formulate the approaches, but more importantly, we try to gather rigorous evidence on whether those approaches are working that helps us modify them to make them more effective. The other main focus of the leadership initiative that I direct is trying to address the research practitioner gap in the realm of leadership. And we started a website. You can look it up. It's called Lead Read Today. So if you just Google Lead Read Today, you should pull it up at Ohio State. And we post material on that multiple times every week. Sometimes it's reposting other articles. Sometimes it's original content. And it's meant to really use and glean from the literature and from scholars themselves practical pieces of advice that practicing leaders can use. to make themselves more effective. So again, it's lead read today. I don't get any kind of commission based on whether you look that up or not, but I think we now have I think maybe 11,000 people who subscribe to the reading list. So it's grown a lot. It was only a few years old. We'd be, I think, deluding ourselves if we thought that in and of itself was going to be the answer. But I do think, one of the ways in which we need to get better is in more translational processes. I think we need to work harder. And again, I think there are some disciplines, medicine again being a good example, that devote a lot of their attention to translating rigorous research into knowledge that medical practitioners and even the general public can make use of. And we need many, many more. You may have been on some of these websites, like the Mayo Clinic website. They have a vast amount of material. If you have dermatitis or some other condition, serious or mild, there are resources that exist that help us as individual consumers leverage the knowledge base to improve ourselves. How much attention and resources do we devote to that in the realm of leadership? Well, very little. Is it because leadership isn't very important? Well, I don't think many people would say that. So I think in the realm of behavioral sciences in general, and leadership in particular, we need to think a lot more seriously and invest a lot more in the translational process. It's not going to solve the problem in and of itself, but we stand little chance if the rigor of the research is going to continue at the level that it is to ever have much influence on policy or practice if we don't invest more in translating in ways that people can understand. So that clearly is I think one way forward. It's, as I noted, partial. It's not the only way, but I think it's really crucial. And I don't think as a field or as an academic enterprise we invest nearly enough in this. Now I'm going to describe another approach that we've been working on. So I think if the starting point really for the work that we've been doing is, I believe in the promise of scientific evidence. I believe, as I've noted, it's provided us a lot of useful insights in the realm of leadership. So we want our model and our approaches to be evidence-based. We also want to focus both on leader emergence and leader development. I think those are distinct processes, particularly when you're dealing with student populations. I think leader emergence is really important. I think often we face this paradox in society where, there's a lot of people who would be talented leaders who are discouraged or, really, kept out of a developmental process and an encouragement and an inclusive perspective. They'd be very talented leaders. They have a lot to contribute. We don't really think enough about and invest enough in how to encourage people who don't see themselves as leaders to embrace the role. And one of the constructs in that I think is useful is leader identity. And we have a lot of first generation college students at Ohio State. I was one myself. And so this idea of leadership emergence, it's hard to hone your leadership skills if you don't see yourself as a leader to begin with. And that can be based on, one of the things that we spend a lot of time teaching is that there can be appointed leaders in particular situations. There's nothing the matter with that, but leadership is a responsibility and a calling and a set of behaviors we all can embrace. And I think positive encouragement, reinforcement is really important in that, because I think more people, I think it's my view in the academic enterprise also, more people fail from self-doubt and a belief that they're not up to the challenge than from, laziness or the inability to work hard. And so I think providing people hope and a perspective and is really critical. It's also true, of course, that leadership is a skill. So focusing on practical skills is something I'll talk a bit about. And I think if we focus more on the practical side of this, and a little less on the theoretical rigor, I think our theories actually would get better. They become more useful. It's also true sometimes we focus on concepts that aren't deployable. They're not malleable. And I think that's really important, as I'll discuss. And then finally, I think we know this idea that people acquire knowledge and then they apply it later. That's a failed model of education. And we know that people learn best when they're actually practicing the skills while they're learning them. I know that's certainly the case with me. I quickly lose interest in something if I'm not able to practice it while I'm learning it. Leadership is something we can do that with, and so these points of perspective really are a foundation of what we're developing. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to skip over. Ben Tepper, who some of you may know, has done work on what's called abusive supervision. He really has been the main person behind that concept. He and I have been working on this. I call it a learning system, and we call it the leader's lever, and I'll discuss why we call it that in a moment. I'm not here to tell you that the leader's lever is going to solve all of the problems of leadership scholarship, nor do I think it's the only reasonable perspective on leadership. It's just our perspective that we think is not the way, but a way to address some of these problems and hopefully make the connection between what we know about leadership and how I can develop myself to be a better leader, to make that linkage closer. So we have some premises with that. Some of this, the first bullet point I've already covered, which is this style approach. So saying that someone is more transformational or autocratic or ethical than someone else is not a particularly useful approach to doing research. And that's typically how we analyze when we collect data and do a leadership study. That's typically the implicit approach that we're using. So if someone's more ethical, if someone scores higher on a measure of ethical leadership than someone else, well, how is that really going to help me become a more ethical leader? We typically don't think through problems in that way. Again, I've also talked about the importance of evidence-based, so I won't reiterate that viewpoint. I will say on this third and last big bullet point here, I think we can draw inspiration from disciplines that I think do a better job of trying to manage this research practice gap. I give some examples here: clinical psychology, behavioral economics, the health sciences, which I've mentioned before. And I think even negotiation, I don't do negotiation research, but I've taught it. And one of the things that always impressed me is that I think many of the skills that you teach when you teach negotiation have been studied in research, and they're actually things that are easy for individuals to implement. So for example, if you're not familiar with negotiation research, we know, for example, that in general, making the first offer, if you're in a negotiation, making the first offer and making that an offer that's very favorable to you will help you negotiate better outcomes for yourself. Well, that's pretty easy to implement in a sense, right? Now, that's the more distributive side of negotiation. We also know that for these so-called win-win negotiations, these integrative negotiations, that actually compromising is not an ideal strategy, that it's actually much more effective to think about negotiation in terms of problem solving. And that's where empathetic listening, sharing information, very particular, discrete skills that you tell people, do this, do that, do this, are quite helpful. And negotiation is complex. It's like leadership. It's an interpersonal process. It's not one thing that one does in isolation by itself. You do it in conjunction with other people. And so I think we can learn from these other disciplines that I think in many ways have done a better job of making their work relevant. I should also say, I think there are examples in leadership research that do this. And a researcher, some of you may know, Drew Carton at Wharton, I think has done just really great research on, I discussed the importance of vision in transformational leadership. And what he has done in his research is basically say, well, I agree with that, that's nice, but how do you communicate a vision? And what he's shown is that imagery, storytelling, painting a picture, activating actually the visual cortex, it's really important to making the vision real to people and involving them in it. And so his research, I think, is a great example of the way that you would read his research. In some ways, it's not arcane. I think many of the elements of what he's talking about, someone without formal training or PhD could read one of his articles and I think get the gist of it, understand the meaning and practical implications of this. And yet it was published in top journals. I wish that kind of research, including more of the research I did, was less unusual and more the norm in our field. So this leader's lever, I'm just going to, before I open it up for questions, because I wanted to spend about an hour or a little less talking about my perspective here and hopefully having plenty of time for Q&A. So if you haven't asked questions yet, this is another cue to please do so. And Mark will read and we'll discuss as many of those as we can. So this learning system that we're developing, what we're trying to do is develop really an experiential learning system from this. It's going to be all online. We don't know if we're even going to commercialize it. That's not been our main motive in doing it. We're working hard on really pursuing this. Ben and I both think we got our PhDs about the same time. I think, in fact, we may have gotten in the same year. And we sort of feel like if we do this well, this will be, I think in some ways, if it works, if it's successful, I don't know whether it will be or not, but I think we both feel it'll be one of the proudest things that we've done if it can really help people learn how to lead more effectively. So that's kind of the overview of the structure of the model. We have sort of 9 principles that we articulate in the model. We're working on sort of a white paper that we're going to, I think, both pursue in an academic angle, but also a more practitioner side of it. And these are some of the principles underlying the leader's lever. So fundamentally, we see leadership as a social influence process. That doesn't mean that's the only way to view leadership, but there was once a New York Times headline that said Afghan leader lacks followers. It was kind of like, what's the matter with this story? Kind of hard to be a leader if you don't have followers. It's also kind of hard to be a leader if you don't have influence. So I think Ben and I both believe at its heart, leadership is an influence process. I think some of that perspective may become a little bit more clear as I discuss this a bit. Number 2 is that leadership matters. Now that's, I think probably you would say, duh. I already thought that would be true. But really the perspective in that is to ask individuals to think through what's the goal. I know myself, when I look at times where I've supervised staff now really for the first time in my career, and I'm sometimes amazed how I go into a meeting without a clear idea what the goal is. What do I want to see happen as a result of this meeting? or I'm working with someone on a project, a practical project, and I think, what is the goal of this? What do I want to see happen? And how does my leadership affect the outcome of that? I just had a meeting, a board meeting, and our dean attended that this afternoon. One thing I was thinking through later is I aspire to influence the dean on a particular point in which we disagree. So I need to think through, and if he were listening to this seminar, I wouldn't mind at all. It's that I have to think through, okay, how do I influence him, or at least attempt to achieve the outcome that I desire? And that makes me think through, what is the goal? What's this all for? What's the objective here? The more clearly we can think about that in a way, the more effective our influence process is going to be. Because sometimes I try to influence people without a clear thinking through clearly, well, what is the goal? And is that really the right goal to have in the first place? A third premise is that leadership and this use of influence tactics affects desired outcomes indirectly. And again, that may seem simplistic, but I don't think that it is, because leaders are held accountable for outcomes. Overwhelmingly, I don't think most organizations are particularly interested in stories. They want results, whether you're nonprofit or for-profit. And leaders, I think, generally are held accountable for those outcomes. And yet, I think a paradox of leadership is that really the leadership process is not a direct impact on the outcomes. And one example of that would be, and I imagine all of you have had times where, let's say you're working with someone who works with you or for you, and they're engaged in something that you ask them to work on, where actually you realize you could do it more effectively yourself. They're either not doing it correctly, or you may have just greater skill or experience in that. It would be easier just to kind of take it over yourself. I've done that. That's not leadership. Doesn't mean it's wrong, right? Sometimes you kind of have to, maybe a crisis, and maybe pressing time, and maybe something, but that's a leadership failure in a sense, when I'm stepping in and doing something directly myself without thinking through, well, what is leadership? And leadership is working with and through others to attain your desired results. So this idea of the indirect part of it, we're going to have trouble thinking clearly about leadership unless we appreciate the indirect nature of it. We spend a lot of time in developing this model, talking about, what's a good lever. And again, lever is just based on this idea of leverage, right? That if you want to change a tire in your car, you can try to pick it up yourself, but it would be a lot easier if you had a jack and were able to apply leverage, which greatly enhances the force that you have to apply to something. So we argue, for reasons I won't just in the sake of time go into later, good levers are concrete, malleable, and high leverage. Fifth, and again, I'll go through these a little more quickly because I do want to make sure we have time for questions. Good levers, I think, can often, what is a good lever in one situation is not going to be a good lever in another. So, and one thing we try to emphasize in training leaders is to assess the situation and try to think through, well, where's a good lever? What is an argument or an approach that's going to be influential in this case? And a lot of times you can figure that out by looking at examples of positive deviance. When is something positive happening when you wouldn't expect it to happen? Or when is there an exception to the rule, something that's not working, but you see a group or a person or a unit where it is working? Many times when we analyze these situations, we'll be able to determine the lever from there. And we give examples of this in what we talk about, because I realize this is fairly conceptual. Okay, I'm just going to move ahead a little more quickly. Another real premise of what we talk about in the lever is that in leadership research, we don't I think through enough the motivation and ability issue. And so a lot of times I think effective leadership is actually cultivating the ability of followers and knowing how to deploy that. So that is a premise, a skill we seek to develop in leaders also, is what does that really mean and how do you do it? And we talk about internal and external ability in ways that I won't discuss right now, but we can. And finally, the last thing I'll talk about here is we do spend a lot of time talking about internal or intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. We think many times in our experience, leaders overemphasize the use of extrinsic motivators, and it's much more powerful if you're able to rely primarily on intrinsic motivation and supplement that with extrinsic when needed, but not to rely primarily on either intrinsic positive rewards or punishments as forms of motivation, because those tend to be quite brittle. You know, the desired behavior will stop as soon as the incentive system stops. And it doesn't mean we think extrinsic incentives are wrong or counterproductive, but leaders should start with the potential of intrinsic incentives and then think how extrinsic incentives can supplement that. And so we talk about that a lot in our learning system. If you want more details on what we're up to, we'd be glad to provide you information that we have and also put you on a list as we develop it. Really, our goal for this to launch is sometime in the upcoming spring. And again, we don't have any idea whether we're going to commercialize it or not. We just want to build it, develop it, and have people use it. So if you'd like more details on what we're up to, we'd be glad to give those to you. And all that you have to do is spend $19.95 on the Ginzu knives, and we'll send you all the information that we have. That was a joke. As I said, we'd be glad to talk with you about it further. So this is drawing to the end of my formal presentation. And I would say, I hope that my talk has sort of reinforced the point that I think researchers and organizations, practitioners each have a role in making this situation better. And I do think that it's really critical that we do draw more of our ideas from practice and less from abstract theoretical concepts. I couldn't agree more with the perspective that's really critical. I think to think more through about policy. There's really we're writing an article on political leadership right now, and it's all oriented toward, I think, trying to have more of a stake in the policy realm. I think one thing we can do in organizations is demand more evidence, even if a leadership approach is not evidence-based or scientific in its development. At least we can collect more rigorous data on knowing whether it works or not. And it's sometimes tragic when we don't do that. And I think again, that goes to the importance of assessment and what we're doing. So the goal is, I think, to make this focus less on the overlap and focus on how we're all oriented toward the same problem. Leadership is at its heart a field that doesn't exist for its own reasons. It's meant to solve problems. And I think sometimes we've gotten away from that imperative. So if you'd like a copy of these slides, please contact us. There's the email of my assistant. Also, I'd love to hear from you. So if you want to contact me directly, Ashley is Kepler28. I'm judge.56 at osu.edu. So I'm glad to hear from you. Even points of divergence, different perspectives that you have, desire to work together, I'd just be delighted. And again, it's an honor to to take part in this series. That's me standing on top of that mountain, by the way, the Grand Teton. Like I said, I climb all over the place, although I would not say I'm that great at it, but I love it. So I like undertaking hard challenges, and certainly I appreciate this is not a simple problem, but I'm not satisfied by the same token by the current state of affairs. So thank you very much. I'm glad to have been here tonight and look forward to any questions you may have.
Thanks very much for that really interesting and rewarding talk. I'd like to turn over to questions as quickly as possible. A few people have asked if this is being recorded, and we'll make the recording available through the School of HRM's YouTube channel, so you can look for it there. A couple of questions that came up initially that addressed similar issues. One from Clark Amistad and another from Jonathan Sturmack-Stein ask about models of leadership. One is, what journal articles would you point towards for the most comprehensive models of leadership behavior? And another asks, of the number of leadership theories, servant leadership, humble, transformational leadership, etc., which do you believe practitioners should be leveraging more, and which do you think are being overused?
So, I do think if you think about the most influential models of leadership research and which ones in balance do the best job, I would point, and I've certainly used it both in my research and teaching it, transformational leadership. I'd be glad to provide you some citations for, I think, really good practical summaries, not arcane, of what the research has shown. Now, I do think, so that the first question is, I do think that's the single best theory that we have, and the most comprehensive on leadership effectiveness. And I do know, for example, Drew Carton's work on sort of translating, well, how do you communicate a vision effectively? It's, I think, really important work. And by the way, if you Google Andrew Carton, you will find some podcasts that he's done and some practitioner-oriented pieces that have been authored or where he's interviewed. So again, Andrew Carton at Wharton, if you Google him, you'll find, I think, a lot of really just really nice, great, easy to comprehend and implement resources on vision communication, which has been really his primary area of focus. So transformational leadership. Now, in terms of, of the current focus on leadership, sort of what I call styles: ethical leadership, benevolent leadership, authentic leadership, what is best? Well, I think they all suffer from the same problem, which is they tend to be style focused. And I think we need to get much more concrete in how we're thinking about leader behaviors, and a little less generalized. And I've given lots of style oriented feedback in my day to students. And, I always had this feeling it was somewhat discouraging to people because, of course, well, I find I don't score as high as I'd like on this, and what am I supposed to do about it? And I really do think we just need to get a lot more concrete. We're working on a study now on leader communication. And what we were trying to do, it sent me down the journey of the communication literature, which I was very ignorant about. And it turns out there are just lots of practical, insights from the field of communications that we can apply in leadership research. And again, we tend to think about this as, if you can't answer to a leader, what can I do today? What concepts or skills or tactics or approaches can I use immediately? You're not going to respond, I think, to the need. And so I think we need to think differently about how we're actually even theorizing about research in the first place.
Thanks. Rick Hackett looks at the supply chain of leadership training and education through to the practice of it. And he mentions leadership scholars, through their classroom teaching, textbooks, and consulting, are likely having substantial practical influence. Large progressive organizations partner with academics in setting up leader identification and development programs. Our graduating and MBA students go into jobs where they can exercise their newly acquired knowledge and skills. Would you agree with this?
No, I would say hello, Rick. I don't think we've ever met, but I've cited your research. I would say no for the. I'll tell you a story. I think it's kind of an interesting story. So I was part of a National Science Foundation panel once, and I was like the I don't know what I was doing there. It had Daniel Kahneman, who, as you know, won the Nobel Prize, and Martin Seligman, and Alan Kruger, who was President Obama's chief economic advisor, and just all of these luminaries. And it was like 12 of us. And at one point, Danny Kahneman was saying how he works with Gallup, and he was saying how I was arguing this research practice gap. And he was saying, no, that doesn't really exist, because I do work with Gallup, and they have this enormous impact on organizations and so forth. And of course, here I am, I'm going to disagree with a Nobel Prize winner, which, lack of intellect or inferior qualifications never stopped me. So I said, I would submit to you, Danny, that Gallup is not consulting with the average organization. I had some idea of what Gallup charges its clients, and it ain't cheap. And as we know, small organizations just absolutely overwhelm large organizations. I'm sure in Canada it's the same as in the US in terms of the number of people they employ. And so what I'm getting at in response to Rick's question is, I think we have a real availability bias in how we look at this. What we see is such a small sample of, I think, what exists out there. And again, I just go back to the relative gap between the researcher's impact and, I think, the what I call the gurus. It's an affectionate term, I think, and their impact. And it doesn't mean that the gurus are wrong. It's that it tends to not be scientific. For example, Lean In, Sheryl Sandberg's book, excellent, great leader. It's a very good book and all that. How do we know that works? Where's the scientific evidence on that? I mean, I've not seen it. It may exist, and a company or an individual that found that really useful. We have to collect rigorous evidence on the back end, really, to document how these work. Otherwise, they become these interesting concepts. They may work, they may not. I don't know how we'd know from a scientific perspective whether they do or don't.
Thanks. Alam Rahman asks, what do you think the future of leadership is within the era of the virtual organization?
That's a very good question. One I think good trend that I've seen in the journals is, in response to this horrible pandemic, of which my country is not a leading example in how to manage it well. Journals have, I think, recognized this is a pretty unique time, a unique phenomenon. So they've tried to prioritize, I think, special issues and rush to press articles that try to deal with this. And I think some of the insights for that will help us understand and advance the topic of virtual leadership, because there has not been enough attention to virtual leadership. And of course, there's going to be a lot more attention to a lot of aspects of virtual communication. And so I think what we know about it is really sparse compared to I think what we need to know, because it's quite possible that a lot of the techniques that, for example, we're advocating in this leaders lever, do we know it works as well in a virtual context or a distributed team context as it does, in the more historical way we think that most people would interact? We don't know. And I think it's really important. Again, I'm more optimistic about journals, I think, emphasizing that, because I do think even when we have a vaccine, even when hopefully this pandemic is behind us, I think there's going to be permanent changes to the way work is done. It's going to be much more virtual. There'll be a lot of benefits to that. I think there'll be a lot, hopefully fewer cars on the roads and a lot less pollution in the air and so forth. The downsides of it in terms of leader-follower relations and communication processes, I think at least I don't think we know enough about that yet. But I do think journals will continue to emphasize that more.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and there are a lot of really good questions here, but I see that one question keeps popping up in various forms. Suha Esedine puts it in a good way. She asks, here in Canada, we've been anxiously following political events in the United States, particularly the style or tone of the current presidency and the recent election. Excuse me. How do you explain the broad appeal of the current president, particularly when we consider his authoritarian and divisive stance?
That is a very good question. I have different talks that I give in leadership, and one of them I do give about political leadership. And I do think, first of all, charisma matters. Sometimes we don't like to admit it, but think what you will of President Trump. He's a very charismatic person, and that influences people more than I think a lot of times people are willing or able to admit. So I think that's not been a trivial part of his appeal. I also think, he struck a chord, and I believe, the US and Canadian economies are not obviously exactly the same, but I think they share more similarities than differences. And there are a lot of changes in the economy that have left a lot of people behind. And I think he directly spoke to that. And I think many of us at the time didn't realize the degree to which a lot of those people felt sort of lost in the system. And I think he was popular for that reason. It's also important to remember, he never, I don't know if there's really ever a point in his presidency where he had more than 50% approval rating. So yes, I was surprised how close he came in the election, but by the same token, he did not win. He rarely was, he was never broadly popular, just a very controversial figure. But I do try to teach my students to analyze leaders as objectively as you can. And I tell you, if you're a Republican or a conservative and you can't think of a positive qualities of a liberal, that you're not thinking objectively, and the reverse is true also. And so I think, all leaders have strengths and weaknesses in areas where they're where they're stronger. We've never seen a candidate in my lifetime like President Trump, and I don't know that we ever will again. He was a pretty unique person, I'll say, in a lot of ways.
This has been really interesting and really fascinating, and well, I'm sure we could keep you here all night. There are a lot of excellent questions here, and I apologize to those whose questions we weren't able to get to, but we've run out of time. And so I'd just like to say thank you again for a really, really interesting talk, and for taking all the questions that we've had for you this evening, and thanks.
Well, I appreciate it, Mark. And again, to reflect, I think many of the things Monica talked about are, I hope, in some ways just coincidentally, that I think are really great points for how we can, I think, get better at the research that we do. And if you could, I'd love to see the questions. So if you could send those to me, that would be great. I don't know if I have access to them, but I appreciate all the questions, even if we didn't have a chance to answer them all. And thanks so much for having me.
Will do. Thanks again. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight.
Bye.
Good night.